Hello, and thank you for being here with the InformNYC Coalition leads and heads of their community groups. I know many of you have hundreds to thousands of members in your community that you'll be speaking to after these meetings. And I first want to welcome and thank Adam Roberts, candidate for District 73 State Assembly. 5 candidates running. He's one of 3 that were willing to join us and really dialogue with us. Thank you for your transparency and accountability and being willing to engage in a thoughtful discussion. You have on the call a great group. Many reside in your neighborhood on the Upper East Side. Many are public school parents, parents of young children. And, you know, we all care about public safety, education, the future of the city, keeping people here. Some of the people on the call have been victims of violent crimes, like myself, victims of, you know, hate crimes, like Susan Lee, who may join us during this. I think it's really important that we get their questions answered. We just had a moderated discussion from Inform My Vote. They were all listening in, and I think they still have some outstanding questions. I'm going to kick it off with the last person that we interviewed, one of the candidates for 73, said they gave us their positions on gifted and talented programming, the SHSAT, and also, you know, I wanted to understand your position on that.
Sure. I feel like all of these issues you're asking me about are deeply personal, but this is one that is also deeply personal. I mean, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for a gifted and talented program like that. You know, I generally wouldn't have been here. And I mean that because I had been a student who at the time was thought to have, you know, perhaps some learning disabilities. And then, you know, was given the option to take a test and see that actually was quite the opposite. And therefore, I was able to get the education that I needed to bring me up to where I should have been. And I hear that from so many people in our community, particularly from parents who immigrated here or first generation, and you know haven't built up that huge generational wealth that would allow them to send their kids to one of those incredibly expensive private schools in the Upper East Side. But nonetheless feel like their children, you know, have earned the right to have a really good education. And so therefore, I think gifted programs are a really good thing. I think removing them for the sake of equality is actually not equal at all. I think we should be lifting everyone up, not punishing people to reach equality.
And what about the SHSAT exam?
So I think testing is not a bad thing so long as it is done well. I support keeping it. I think, you know, we don't want to be a education system where we're entirely relying upon tests, but we also don't want to be one where there's absolutely no tests at all, because then how do we have any standard of comparing children and seeing what the best school is for them?
Thank you. Hunter, did you want to pose your question on education, please?
Well, actually, that was a great one. I kind of thought to ask the same thing myself. You know, if you could just maybe talk very briefly about, you know, how do we bring all kids up? And you've already started to talk about what you think for kids that are above the kind of above grade level or have high potential. We also have kids that are twice exceptional that have IEPs and also have that ability. And you have kids that are behind, and we need to be able to have those kids ready for like the SHSAT test or whatever. And how do we bring up the rest of those kids, and how can the state be involved in ensuring that that happens?
Well, I think we need to be providing more school choice, first of all. I think students are all different. And if you look at the education systems in pretty much any other country, students are allowed to go to whatever school is best fitting their needs. And I think that we need to be providing more options so that students are getting the sort of specialized education that they can get and deserve, so that their potential is being maximized. So I think that's part of it. I think limiting school choice is not the solution. I think there should be district schools, charter schools, all sorts of schools. If people want to send their kids to a private school and it's up to standards, then great. You know, I went to I grew up on Long Island, so I went to the equivalent of a district public school. And that was a good education for me, but that education wasn't necessarily great for everyone. And I've seen that with friends who struggled over the years after school, despite going to what was considered an elite public school. So I think the core of it is really just making sure that education is as personalized as possible.
Thank you. And do you support mayoral control of schools?
I'm actually a little resistant to that. I'm someone who strongly believes in participatory democracy. I think, as much as there were problems with school boards when we had them and they were elected, that at least that provided parents with the opportunity to vote for what they wanted for their children. I think it made parents more engaged in the public school system. As someone who went to public schools, and I hope my children go to public schools here, I think that's a good thing. I think we want parents to be invested in participating. And just removing any sort of democratic element, I think has been a real problem. I think that we've seen a lot of parents lose interest in the public school system. Maybe they haven't left and gone to the suburbs, but they're sending their kids to private school. And nothing wrong with a private school, but if we want a functioning public school system, it has to be diverse.
Okay, I'm going to go to, well, actually, let me just ask you your position on civil liberties, because some people think if you vote for a Democratic candidate, that you automatically are protecting abortion rights and same-sex marriage. However, even on the Democratic candidate side, one of the candidates for Governor Jumaane Williams doesn't personally support abortion or same-sex marriage. So if you could just very briefly say, do you support both or not?
I strongly support both and have always supported both.
Thank you. I'm going to jump over now to Cynthia Tibbs because she has a lot of calls today. Cynthia, can you pose your question on NYCHA housing?
So as you already know, NYCHA is in disrepair, and under our current CEO, he feels that the only way to get things done is through privatization. If elected, are you willing to listen to resident leaders that represent over 400,000 NYCHA residents and understanding why we feel that the route to privatization will ultimately cause not only gentrification in our areas, but will lead to mass evictions when people are not able to meet the requirements met under Section 8? Are you willing to listen not only to us, but to vote with us instead of taking the stances many political people are right now and going against our decisions and quote unquote doing what they feel is in our best interest?
Absolutely. I mean, NYCHA is something I've worked extensively on, representing New York City's architects. Many of them work at NYCHA or consultants for NYCHA. So this is a major issue that I've worked on, and I very strongly believe NYCHA should not be privatized. I'm deeply concerned that it will be. We've seen this happen in pretty much most other major American cities. Is some or all of their public housing has been privatized, and the results of that have been really detrimental. Their homelessness is often caused there by just a rise in people who've literally lost access to an affordable home, and we don't want to see that in New York. So I think we need NYCHA to get a major source of funding right now, or else that is going to happen, especially if we get mayoral administration or governor or federal government who are less supportive of the concept of public housing in the first place.
Okay, and one quick thing, are you currently aware that the federal government, HUD, supplies NYCHA with $30 million a month for capital repairs, and yet the CEO only spends 6% of that money earmarked for repairs and the rest goes towards consulting fees?
I was not aware of those numbers, but that is good to know.
Thank you.
Isabel, from Small Property Owners of New York, also an Upper East Side resident. Can you ask your question?
Yes, good morning. I have two questions. The first is if good cause eviction isn't passed in the next 2 days, it'll most likely be again on the, an issue for next year. First of all, what's your position on good cause eviction? And then quickly, my second question is the HSTPA critically reduce the amount of money that we can invest in properties in order to get a rate of return. If an apartment's been occupied for 50 years, we can still only do about $15,000 worth of renovations, which obviously doesn't bring that apartment up to code. So a lot of those apartments ends up sitting vacant. So what's your position on potentially amending the HSTPA to allow us to do that work and occupy those apartments?
Yep. So, again, this is something working in architecture I've worked extensively on. Good cause is something that I support in concept, but not the current legislation is written. I mean, I definitely think we shouldn't have rent increases that are astronomical, which unfortunately we are seeing in some cases. We also shouldn't have it limited to below inflation, which is what we're currently seeing proposed, as it just makes it unprofitable for anyone to own a building. And therefore, why would someone, besides doing the absolute basics to keep it up to code, properly maintain their units? And that, to me, this is common sense. And I think, most people I speak to on the street here, this is common sense. But unfortunately, for a lot of legislators, they just don't seem to understand that. And I don't think we should be punishing people for owning a building. I think if people want to be a landlord, they should be able to be a landlord. Like when I'm standing on the street on the Upper East Side, real estate seems to be the industry that most Democratic primary voters are working in. So at least here, it's seems to make the most political sense to be supporting, what the constituents actually do in their profession. So as for major capital improvements, I do think that, again, as with significant rent increases, we do need some sort of government oversight, but I think maybe these went too far. There has to be some sort of system where we're able to stop landlords and architects from harassing tenants to drive them out, but also then make sure that a good landlord can still do work on an apartment and make sure that that tenant has an apartment that is up to code, or is, goes maybe even a little beyond up to code. So it's not just checking the boxes, but actually maintains a good tenant-landlord relationship. So, I think that these are well-intentioned policies that have just gone way too far. And it's, as someone who works in real estate, I think it just shows the importance of having people who've actually been in our industry be in elected government, so that they can talk to their colleagues and say that this is actually not how it works. Let's make some changes to make sure that it functions better.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Isabel. Yaten, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Adam, for joining us. The Asian community is particularly concerned and really scared every day in terms of public safety in our streets and in our subways. We talked about bail reform fixes. Another piece of legislature that's being considered is the Clean Slate Act, that wipes out basically the records, expunges the records of misdemeanors after 3 years, and felony with the exception of murder and sex crimes after 7 years. Do you have a position on this, and what are details that you would be concerned with? Thank you.
Sure. So I do think people do have the, if they've earned it, they have the right to have some sort of clean slate. I don't think someone should be held accountable for something they did decades ago, if they've really made an effort to change their lives in a positive way. I believe in forgiveness on a personal and moral level. At the same time, I think there need to be some standards and limits of what that is. And this is where I think discretion comes into place. This is where we need to, provide those government employees who are overseeing this with the ability to use their discretion, and hopefully have some sort of standards to make sure that the people making these decisions are smart, educated people in the criminal justice system.
Thank you. And then Alfonso, you have a question.
Yes, how you doing, Mr. Adams? Do you think it's a good idea for community leaders or, the community board to be involved with the oversight and the conditions and the treatment that's going on inside shelters inside their community? And I have another question. Also, do you think it's a good idea to try to educate the low-income community schools certain things, maybe as street smarts, because they're at the age of 13, they're already committed to gangs? So, my question is, how can you catch them earlier before that?
So two really good questions. I'd say the first one with community boards. I think there's a lot wrong with community boards. I've worked really hard in my day job for the American Institute of Architects to make sure that we address the fact that many people on community boards have no expertise in what they're overseeing, like shelters, and therefore making sure that we have actual architects who design shelters and supportive housing be on community boards. So I'm really proud that I've gotten over 50 architects appointed to community boards throughout the city. That being said, I wish I could tell you that was enough. That's nowhere near enough. You know, there's some inherent problems with community boards, is that they're unelected. And therefore you often get people, serving on them, protecting their own interest, which is their right, as community boards are currently set up. But I think we need maybe some more electoral supervision over community boards, because we often have these situations where a handful of people don't really represent the community, but nonetheless have this official position of being on a community board and speaking on behalf of it. And we've seen this with shelters, we've seen this with attempts to build housing, transportation, all sorts of changes, which, you stand on the street and talk to Democratic primary voters, 99.9% of them want, and yet they wonder, why hasn't this gotten done in my community? As for the second with, stopping the pathway to gangs, I think this is why we need to make sure that our education system is a little more personalized. Right now in most outer borough areas, which is where, gang violence has been soaring, you mostly just have district schools. I mean, maybe some charter schools, but they're limited and therefore only very few kids are going to them. Most people are joining a gang because they feel like that's like their only option. So we need to be providing people with more options that aren't just gangs. And it's not, so, a lot of that has to do with education, because when you're, 10, that is most of your life, is going to school and then seeing your parents later in the day. So we need to be having schools that are, for what a child wants to do when they grow up, not just, what the city says they should be doing.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you everyone for being here. Adam, I really appreciate, again, you being here and listening to all of these incredible people who are working so hard in their communities. And mostly, almost everyone I look at as volunteers or just a personal stake in our communities. So thank you for hearing our voices, for listening, and being very transparent about what your plans are if elected. Again, everyone, if you liked what Adam Roberts had to say, he's the candidate for State Assembly, District 73. Adam, I'll give you just about a minute if you just want to say anything in closing to this group before they go back to their memberships later this week and discuss what they've heard.
Sure, I'll keep it really quick and just say, thank you all so much for this opportunity and for your questions. In the assembly, I hope to be someone who you can come to, agree or disagree, and we can have a positive conversation. And not just that, actually fix legislation and move it in a place that it can be more, better functioning. I think most legislation, most policies that people are unhappy with don't need to be completely rewritten. They just need to be fixed. But we need to have elected officials who are being willing to listen to a diverse group of audiences and voices to make sure that legislation and those policies are fully functioning. So I just want you to know I will have an open door to you no matter what the issue is.
Thank you so much. Adam Roberts, everyone, District 73. Adam, I'm going to let you go. We have